Dr. Jones, Dr. Jones. They sounded so important. All of that stuff drove me on. It made me want to do it. But, you know, there were some problems along the way. You know, my parents got divorced early on. That was a devastating blow. Like all young boys, I wanted to see my father, and recognizing that he wasn't going to come home anymore, that was really quite devastating. Now, it turns out there was a reason, a legitimate reason for that divorce. My mother was one of 24 children, and she got married when she was 13. And she and my father moved from rural Tennessee to Detroit, where he was working in a factory. And then she discovered some years later that he was a bigamist. That means he had another family. He was already married when he married her. So that's what occasioned the divorce. And after the divorce, you know, my mother had only a third-grade education, so she didn't have much in the way of skills, much in the way of money. So we actually moved from Detroit to Boston to live with her older sister and brother-in-law in a typical tenement, large multi-family dwelling, sirens and gangs, murders. I can remember seeing people lying on the ground with bullet holes and stab wounds, waiting to die. Both of my older cousins, who we loved dearly, were murdered. But, you know, perhaps the thing that bothered me the most were the roaches. They had large, aggressive roaches. You know, in the more upscale areas, they call them water bugs, but we knew what they were. And these things, not only would they crawl on your table, they would crawl in your cereal box. So if you were eating Raisin Bran, you had to know what those brown things were in the box. And then there were rats, the water rats. Now these things were so big. The first time I saw one, I thought it was a dog. I mean, these things they were huge. And we were afraid to go in some places because, you know, you'd see these rats and there'd be a couple of them in the alleyway. You wouldn't go down there because you figured you wouldn't come back. But while we were there enjoying that environment, my mother was out working 2, sometimes 3 jobs at a time as a domestic, cleaning other people's houses. And the reason she was willing to go from one job to the next job to the next was because she did not want to be on welfare. The reason she didn't want to be on welfare is because she was very observant. Only a third-grade education, but very observant. She noticed that no one she ever saw go on welfare came off of it. So she didn't want to go on it in the first place. She didn't want to be dependent on other people when she could do for herself.
That's right.
And you know, that is an incredibly important concept. The concept of self-reliance and not being dependent on someone else when you have the ability to do something yourself.
Amen.
You know, today, in today's world, you have a lot of people who would much rather just sit down and let somebody else do the work and maybe give them a check. But you know what? We were made in the image of God.
That's right.
He did not make us to sit around and do nothing when we have the perfect capability of making a decision to do something.
Amen.
And to develop ourselves and to be somebody who not only improves our own lives, but the lives of those people around them. It makes all the difference in the world. Well, you know, the other thing that I really appreciated about my mother is that she didn't like excuses. You know, it didn't matter what you said, what had happened, she would always ask one question. She would say, do you have a brain? And if the answer to that was yes, then she would have said, well, it really doesn't matter what John or Mary or Susan or Robert or anybody else said or did. Because if you have a brain, you could have thought your way out of it. You don't have to do something just because they're doing it. And you know, when somebody doesn't accept your excuses, pretty soon you stop looking for excuses. And you start looking for solutions. And that is such an important concept. You know, when I think about people who were not excuse makers, I think of the original Siamese twins, Chang and Ing Bunker. They were born in Siam in 1811. Anybody know where Siam is? It's Thailand now, but it used to be called Siam. And they were joined at the chest, something we call thoracopagus or xiphopagus twins. They were the ones who made Barnum and Bailey famous. Traveled all over the world with the circus. Everybody knew about Chang and Ing. Eventually, they left the circus and they moved to the United States, to the state of North Carolina, where they became farmers. Now, can you imagine that? Being a farmer, stuck to somebody's chest, staring them in the face 24/7, smelling their breath 24/7, and not using that as an excuse? These guys were amazing. Not only were they successful farmers, but they got married to 2 different women. And between them, no pun intended, they had 21 children. Yeah.
What? What?
So what that tells you is that they were extraordinarily creative fellows also. Now, here's what was really interesting. As it turns out, their wives absolutely could not stand each other. So they had to live with one wife one week and the other wife the next week.
What?
So they ran 2 successful farms, and they lived until they were 63 years old, which was much older than most people lived back in those days. What does that tell you about just sucking it up and not making excuses? If they were able to do that, think what you're able to do, and you're just by yourself, not stuck to somebody. It makes all the difference in the world. Well, at any rate, you know, my mother figured if she worked long enough and hard enough, she could become independent of her older sister and brother-in-law. And after a few years, that did happen. We were able to move back to Detroit, still in a multi-family dwelling, still with significant wildlife, but nevertheless, you know, she was independent at that time. And I was a student in the 5th grade. Now, I was a terrible student, probably the worst student you've ever seen. I thought I was stupid. Everybody else thought I was stupid. I was always the butt of all the jokes about being stupid. People teased me incessantly. But you know what? I was pretty good at one thing. And this is how I got back at my classmates. I was very good at getting other people kicked out of class. Because what I would do is I would just study them and figure out what made them really, really angry. And I would just irritate them until they were about to explode. But I would never push the last button to make them explode until we were in class and the teacher was nearby. Then I would do it, they would explode, the teacher would kick them out, and I'd say, yeah, this is great. Because I wouldn't be the only one who didn't learn anything that day. Well, there was this one girl, you probably all know a girl like this. Her name was Miss Goody Two-Shoes. You know what I'm talking about? Everything perfect, pristine, absolutely made everybody else look like a total jerk. I said, wow, wouldn't it be great to get her kicked out of class? So I started studying her, trying to figure out what made her angry, but you couldn't make her angry. She was cool, calm, and collected. You just couldn't get her angry. But I kept it up. I finally figured out what got her, what made her angry. I tell you, she was boiling. The steam was coming out of her ears. She was about to explode. I didn't push the last button. I waited till we were in class. Lo and behold, she sat right down at the desk in front of me. I said, the Lord is good. And as the teacher approached, I pushed the last button. I started irritating her. But she didn't explode. She just calmly turned around. And she said, you and me on the playground at recess. So that didn't work out all that well. I did stop irritating people after that. But, you know, the kind of student that I was reminds me a lot of some of the students that I encounter these days who have very, very superficial knowledge of things. They can tell you about the baseball team and the stars on the baseball team, And they can tell you about famous entertainers. And they can tell you about the Super Bowl, which was pretty good. The Ravens won, but I gotta tell you, is that really the most important thing? Because you see, that kind of information and 50 cents might get you a can of soda. It's not going to get you a whole lot more than that. And that's why it's so important to begin to think of the right kinds of things. You know, in the United States, and probably here as well, about 30% of people who enter high school do not finish high school. And you know what? This is the technological age. This is the age of information. And therefore, it is absolutely vitally important that you have technical knowledge if you're going to be successful in the future. Now, some people say, but I'm not good at math. Anybody here not good at math? I see several. Anybody not good at science? Let me see. Okay, now, let me tell you a secret. All those people who just raised your hand, you are good at math. You are good at science. And let me tell you a secret. Math and science are just like reading. Can you read? Do you know why you can read? You can read because you know all 26 letters of the alphabet. What if you only knew 21 of them? You'd still know the vast majority. Let's say you just didn't know A, D, O, S, and T. You knew all the rest. What could you read? Nothing. As soon as you picked up a book and started reading, you say, I can't read. This is for somebody who's smart. I'm not good at reading. And yet we go back and fill in those 5 letters and all of a sudden, whoo, read everything in sight. Math and science, exactly the same way. Everything builds on something else. They're building blocks. If you put the building blocks in place, it makes perfectly good sense. But if you don't, it's going to fall apart very quickly. So here's what I recommend for those of you who think you're not good at math and science. I want you, and you've got to do this, okay? You got to take some personal responsibility. If you're not good at math, you go back in your math books, go back a year or two, go back to the place where it was easy, and then work your way back up to where you are, because you can figure out what you didn't get. You add that in, all of a sudden, it makes perfectly good sense. It's the same thing a good teacher does, but you can do it on your own as well. And there are lots of teachers who are quite willing to help you with that, but you have to take some personal responsibility in terms of doing those kinds of things. Well, at any rate, you know, as a youngster, I couldn't wait until school was out. The bell rang, I was running home to play baseball, basketball, football, dodgeball, any kind of ball. Throwing rocks at cars, I love doing that. Tell me, which of you have ever thrown rocks at cars? Let me see your hands. Oh, we got a lot of honest people here. We got a lot of honest people. Okay. I'm impressed, okay? I'm impressed. Now, okay, quiet. Now, let me tell you why it was so much fun throwing rocks at cars. Because sometimes there would be old people in the car, and they would get mad, and they would stop the car, and they would get out, and they would chase you. And we loved that, and we would run slowly to encourage them. And then when they got nearby, we were gone like a flash, you know. But sometimes the police would come in unmarked cars, and we wouldn't know it was police until they were right there on us. They'd be chasing us across the field. And there were these tall fences, they were about 10 feet tall, and they thought they had trapped us. They had no idea how good we were at getting over those fences. I mean, it was like an Olympic event. We would run straight toward the fence, never break stride, leap high onto the fence, let the momentum of our feet swing us over, drop down on the other side, all in one motion, and laugh at them because they couldn't do that. Now, of course, that was back in the days before they would shoot you. And then when it was too dark to do that, it was in the house to watch TV. Now, if I was in the house with you, you did not need a TV guide, because I could tell you what was on every station, every hour, every minute. I could tell you about all the latest fashions, I can tell you what was going on with the sports teams. I can tell you the name of every car going down the streets of Detroit, make, model, year, and price. But you know what? That information ain't going to help you that much. That was the problem. And my mother was very much alarmed, and she didn't know what to do. So you know what she did? She prayed. She asked God to give her the wisdom. What could she do to get her young sons to understand the importance of developing their own brain so they could control their own life? That was what she wanted. And I got to tell you, as a youngster, there was one thing that I really, really hated. Some people hate spiders. Some people hate snakes and scorpions and rats. You know what I really hated? I hated being poor. I hated poverty. I couldn't stand being poor. I would do all kind of silly stuff. Like when my mother would send me to the store to buy something, and we had to use food stamps, if somebody got in line behind me that I recognized, I would get out of line, act like I forgot to get something. Hopefully they'd be gone by the time I came back to the counter. If I'd been thinking, I would have realized they probably had food stamps too. But anyway, I just didn't like it. But, my mother prayed for wisdom, and she worked as a domestic in other people's homes, and these were wealthy people, and she noticed that they didn't spend a whole lot of time watching television. They spent a lot of time reading. They were always reading. They were always gathering knowledge. They were always strategizing. So she came home one day and turned off the TV and said, "You guys are going to start reading books. And you're going to read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries every week and submit to me a written book report. And you're only going to watch 2 or 3 TV programs during the week." I thought that was ridiculous. And her friends were saying to her, "You can't make boys stay in the house and read books. They'll grow up and they'll hate you." And I would say, "Mother, they're right." But it didn't matter. It didn't matter because she was determined that we were going to read those books. And even though I didn't like it very much in the beginning, after a while, I actually began to enjoy reading those books. Because even though we were desperately poor, we never had money for anything. If we could go to the state fair, there was only enough money to get in. Never enough money to ride any of the rides or to buy any cotton candy. It was only in my adulthood that I ever tasted cotton candy for the first time. It's no big deal, don't worry about it. But at any rate, there was never money for anything. But between the covers of those books, I could go any place in the world. I could be anybody, I could do anything. I began to imagine myself in a laboratory, looking through a microscope, discovering new things, looking through a telescope, discovering new galaxies. I began reading about people of great accomplishment. I remember reading about Booker T. Washington, who was born a slave. It was illegal for slaves to read, but he taught himself to read. He read everything he could get his hands on, and he became an advisor to 2 different presidents. And I began to understand what people can do with the talent that they have themselves, with the choices that they make. I read the story of Joseph in the Bible, sold into slavery by his own brothers. Now, did he say, "Bummer, my own brothers sold me into slavery"? No. He said, "If I'm going to be a slave, I'll be the best slave there is." And he ended up being over the household of Potiphar, who was the captain of the Egyptian guard, over the whole household. And then Potiphar's wife said, "Whoa, this is a good-looking dude. I need to deal with him." But he had morals. He had values. He did not yield to her temptation. And she told a lie on him, and he ended up in jail. Did he say, "Here I am trying to live up to the principles and the values that I've been taught, and I end up in jail"? No, that's not what he said. He said, "If I'm going to be a prisoner, I'll be the best prisoner there is." And he ended up with a responsible position in the prison, ended up interpreting dreams, and ended up as the governor of Egypt. Because he didn't allow himself to become a victim. He decided that whatever the situation was, he would take advantage of it. And as I began reading stories about people like this, something happened in me. I understood that the person who had the most to do with what happened to me in life was me. It wasn't somebody else. It wasn't the environment in Detroit. It wasn't somebody who was trying to stop me from going somewhere. It was me and the decisions that I would make. And it was the energy that I wanted to put into my decisions. And I'll tell you what else happened. All of a sudden, I didn't mind being poor anymore. And the reason I didn't mind being poor anymore is because I knew I could change it. I could completely change that situation. And you know, it's sort of like if I asked you to put your foot in a bucket of ice water. You're probably not too anxious to do that, but if you know you can take it right back out, it's not so bad. And I knew that I could get out of that ice bucket of poverty with my own efforts. And it made all the difference in the world. Well, what was I doing? I was taking advantage of the greatest gift that we have. And what is that gift? The brain. The human brain. Your brain has billions and billions of neurons. Hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers everything you have ever heard, everything you've ever seen. You've heard people say sometimes, don't learn all that stuff, you'll overload your brain. Let me tell you, as a neuroscientist, you cannot overload your brain. Your brain is capable of receiving one new fact every second, processing it, and before you begin to reach the capacity, it would take approximately 3 million years. And I don't know anybody who lives that long, so you don't have to worry about overloading your brain. You can't do it. I could take the youngest person here, I could bring him up on the stage, stand him right here with his eyes blindfolded, and take off the blindfold and say, I want you to scan the room, just like that. Put the blindfold back on, carry him away, bring him back 50 years later, make a little hole right here on the temporal side of the brain, put in a depth electrode into the hippocampus, and stimulate, and they would be able to tell me where everybody had been sitting and what they had on and what they looked like 50 years ago. That's how fast and completely your brain is capable of processing information. How many people remember your birthday? Let me see your hand. All right, you guys are good. Okay, I'm impressed. Now, listen carefully, because I'm going to tell you right now what your brain had to do in a split second in order for you to respond to that question. First of all, the sound waves had to leave my lips, travel through the air, enter your external auditory meatus, travel down to your tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force, and travel across the ospicles of the middle ear to the oval and round one, the set up a vibratory force in the endolymph, converting the mechanical energy to electrical energy, which traveled across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the frontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, ascending bilaterally at the brainstem to the lateral meniscus to the inferior colliculus and the medial geniculate nuclei, across the thalamic radiation to the posterior temporal lobes, begin the auditory processing, from there to the frontal lobes, coming down the tract of Victor's jury, retrieving the memory from the medial hippocampal structure and the mammary bodies back to the Mabet cell level, the motor response coming down the cortical spinal tract, across the internal capsule, into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervical medullary decussation, into the spinal cord, gray matter, synapsing, going out to the neuromuscular junction, so you could raise your hand. And that's the simplified version. Now, see if you can get one of those rap singers to do that. But you know what? If your brain can do all that, and you barely have to think about it, what is your brain capable of if you actually put your mind to something?